Hi friends, and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to dive into SageMaker Data Wrangler and see how to wrangle our data. But first, just a couple quick slides for setup. As you may already know, there's several steps in the overall machine learning process, and these first three steps here, fetch, clean, and prepare, are by far the most time-consuming part of the process. These are usually iterative as well, where you'll fetch some data, clean it, analyze it, then go back and get more data, and keep iterating until you have what you need. Even with just this little data set here on the slide, we have several problems. The column headings aren't consistent, one uses an underscore and one doesn't. In the first name we have punctuation, not necessarily wrong as these are legitimate names, but we need to make sure that we can handle that. In the state and country columns we have inconsistent naming, some abbreviations, some blanks, some nulls, some dashes. Similar problem with our zip codes where there are blanks and zip codes aren't the same length. For age, we have different decimal formats, an NaN, or not a number, and likely a typo with that age of 450 years, or actually maybe that's the age in months rather than years. For gender, here again we're inconsistent with our naming and abbreviations, we have some blank values. And for salary, we have formatting issues, different currencies, and missing values. And not shown here, but it's also common to have duplicate records or rows. So we need to get these sorts of things cleaned up before this data is really going to be useful to us. Also, it's really helpful to visualize and analyze your data. This helps you understand the data better and the relationships that you might have inside of it. So getting things like rows and columns and mean and median and min and max and standard deviation and so on, these can be really helpful to understand the data better. And that's where SageMaker Data Wrangler comes in. There's 5 main functions. We're going to walk through all of them in a demo, but basically you're going to import your data, then set up a data flow where you define all the different steps that you need to prep your data. Then you can transform it, things like dropping missing values, encoding your data, selecting the data to keep, and so on. You can analyze the data using things like scatter plots, histograms, and summary tables. And finally, export it as a data wrangler job, and/or you can export just the resulting data so that it can be integrated into the overall ML workflow. The dataset we're going to be using for the demo is for the Titanic, one of the most infamous shipwrecks in history, of course. During her ill-fated maiden voyage in 1912, there were 2,224 passengers on board, and ultimately 1,502 met their demise. But looking at the passenger survival data, it's interesting to see that some groups of people were more likely to survive than others, and using machine learning, we can answer the question of who those folks were. If you go out to your favorite search engine and just search for Titanic dataset, this is a very popular dataset, and there's lots of places to download it. The dataset I'll be working with actually came from openml.org, and I'll include this link in the description below. I'd recommend that you grab this version as well, just so that all of your numbers match up with mine in the demos. Some of the other downloadable datasets have already been cleaned up a little bit, so they're not going to have the same number of rows or some of the same problems that this particular set has. So go ahead and grab the CSV version, and I'd recommend renaming it to something a little bit more human-friendly. So Titanic.csv. Once that finishes, let's just take a quick look through and see what the data looks like. All right, you'll see the different columns I have here. P class is passenger class, that's first class, second class, or third. Survived, whether they survived or not. And then other information like name, sex, age, number of siblings and spouses aboard, number of parents and children aboard, the ticket number, the fare, cabin, where they embarked. These are abbreviations for the place they got on the boat, and then additional information here as well. But then just briefly scrolling down the different rows or records here, you'll see that we've got missing data with the question marks. Things are formatted a little bit differently, so kind of messy even in a fairly small data set like this. Let's see how we can use SageMaker Data Wrangler to clean this up and make sense of it so that we could use it to train a model. Starting here in the AWS Management Console, I'll navigate to SageMaker. We're going to be using SageMaker Studio for this. If you're new to that, I've linked a video up above to help you get started. But I'll click on Studio here, and then over here, Launch App and Studio. All right, what we want to do is come up to File, New, Data Wrangler Flow. This might take a few minutes to create all of those things that we talked about earlier in the slides, of being able to load your data set, transform your data, analyze it, and so on. All of that lives within this flow, which is basically your pipeline. So when you create the flow, it's going to spin up a new instance. That instance type is ml.m5.4x_large. If for some reason you aren't able to run that instance type due to a quota or something like that, then you're not going to be able to run Data Wrangler. I have just a basic account. There's nothing special to this, and I have access to that instance type just fine, so it's probably not an issue. I'll let this run, pause the video, and be right back. All right, we're up and running, and over here you'll see that instance, the ML M5 4x large. If you don't see that, just click on this button right here. You can also rename your flow. We didn't do that initially, so you can right-click on your tab, rename, and we'll call this Titanic flow. Okay, the first thing we need to do is import our data set. You'll see at the moment we can only import from S3 or Amazon Athena. S3 is super easy, so let's go do that. I'll open up a new tab and come into the console. Navigate to S3. Link above to a video about the S3 basics if you need that. But let's create a new bucket. And I'll just call this Data Wrangler Titanic, and then today's date. I'll leave everything else the defaults. Say create bucket. I'll click into that bucket, and now we need to upload that CSV file for the Titanic dataset. I've got that right here, so I'll just drag that over and upload. Perfect. Now if we go back to Data Wrangler, we can import data, select that bucket that we just created, and there's my data set. You'll see here in the middle we get a preview of the data, the first 100 rows, all the way over all the different columns that are coming in. So this can be a nice sanity check just to make sure that everything's coming over correctly. And then over here on the right you could change the name of it if you wanted, change the file type, or as a CSV, so we'll leave that. We do have the first row as a header, so we'll leave that as well, and then we'll say import. Now when you do that import, Data Wrangler is going to automatically infer the data type for each column. If you want to see what it guessed, then you can click the plus sign here to the right of your data types, go to Edit Data Types, and then over here on the right you'll see the column name and the data type that it chose. So you can review these. If you need to change anything, just click into the drop down here and you could update that. But we're going to say that everything looks good and then go back to our data flow. All right, so far we just have the two steps here. Basically, we went out and grabbed our data from S3, and then we've got the data types for everything. Now let's do some transforms and analysis to try to make sense of the data that we have. To add things to the flow, you'll just want to click on this plus sign here on the right. And just to get a better sense of our data, let's start with a summary snapshot of things like the min, the max, the mean, and so on. And those fall under analysis. So we'll add analysis. And then here on the top right, you'll see the different types of analysis that we can do. Quite a few here. Let's start with the table summary. So we're getting things like count, mean, standard deviation, min, and max. And just using count, you'll see that we have count, the passenger class, 1,309 rows or records that are coming in. You'll see for age, though, we have fewer than that, so we're missing some data there. But everything else is coming over just fine. And you can verify the age missing values. So scrolling down here on the bottom, you'll see that one's missing, some others missing as well. So a nice kind of sanity check as you're looking at your summary. Looking at some of our mean, min, and max values, let's take a look at the fare, how much somebody paid for this. So you'll see the mean is 33, but then we've got a max fare of 512. So we've got some outliers in the data. And feel free to kind of dig into this a little bit more, but this is a nice snapshot of what we're dealing with. All right, let's give this an analysis name. I'll just call it table summary. And then before you can save it, you'll see that's grayed out. You'll need to preview, which is basically the same as what we had before, and then save. All right, let's add another analysis by create new analysis. This time, let's go with the histogram. So a nice way to visualize what you're working with. For the x-axis, let's go with sex, and then color by survived. And we'll preview. And here we go. So we've got female on the left, male on the right, and then the darker blue means they survived. So just visually looking at this, more than twice the number of females survived as compared to males. You could also try looking at this by age, let's say, and preview. And just from a pure count perspective, we've got folks in their 20s and 30s with a higher count for survival. All right, so there's lots of ways that you can better understand your data, additional types up here that you can play around with. Let's go ahead and save this one though. We'll say survival by age histogram. We'll have to hit preview and then save that. And feel free to add some more here and kind of play around with the data. But I'm going to go back to the data flow. And this time, let's add to our flow by doing some transforms. So add transform. And the transform is where you can actually manipulate your data, as opposed to just viewing a summary or viewing a visualization like we did with analysis. To do this, we'll say add step. And we want to add a step to drop the columns that we don't need to train the model. For example, somebody's name is probably not something that's going to help us determine whether they survived or not, or where they got on the ship, their embark location. So there's two different ways you can drop columns. There's built-in transforms, and then you can also do a custom transform and use your own code, like Python code. We'll start by using the built-in transform. Down here, there's one called Manage Columns. You'll see that you can move, drop, or duplicate, or rename columns. So we'll select this, and then columns to drop. There's quite a few that we can just say we aren't interested in. Let's do that for cabin, ticket, name, siblings and spouses, parents and children, home destination, boat, and body. All right, let's do a preview. And then over here on the left, you'll see that our data set's been whittled down. Then click Add. So there's the transform that we just added to drop the column. Let's add another one. It's pretty common to need to handle missing data. And there's a built-in transform for that, handle missing data. And the transform here will say drop missing. And the column that we want to use here is going to be age. And you'll see the message that basically says any rows that have missing data in the age column, those rows are going to be dropped. So we'll preview, add, and let's do the same thing for missing, handle missing fares. So we'll drop missing, and this column will be fare. Once again, preview, add, and now let's take a look at the custom transforms where you can write your own code. So custom transform. If you look at the options for code, we can use PySpark, Pandas, or PySpark SQL. We'll take a look at that one later, but let's do Pandas. And then just to get an overall look at our data set after we've done those transforms, let's do a df for dataframe.info, open close paren, preview. And then over here, you'll see that we have 1,045 entries, or rows remaining after we got rid of those missing rows. All right, next let's encode some of our data. If you aren't familiar with that concept, let me just quickly take you back to the slides to show you an example of what I mean. A lot of algorithms work better with ones and zeros rather than letters or words like we have here for the embarked location. So this is where folks got on the ship. We have three options: Queenstown, Southampton, and Cherbourg, if I'm saying that correctly. With encoding, you basically take each of those values for where the passenger could have embarked and create a new feature or a new column for it. So embarked Queenstown, embarked Southampton, and embarked Cherbourg, like we have here. And then you'll use zeros and ones to denote those embark locations. So for instance, this top row where we have Queenstown, we have 1 in the embarked Queenstown and 0 for the other 2. And that continues down the rest of the rows. So back to SageMaker Data Wrangler, let's do that with some of our data. I'll back up here and add transform. This is going to be a custom transform as well. I've got some code on my clipboard for this one. This will also be Pandas. I'll put this code in the description below if you want to copy paste. But this will basically encode or create new columns for the different options for P class or passenger class, sex, and embarked. Right, I'll preview and then add. And if you look at the data I'm just hitting the right arrow key to move all the way over. You'll see that we've got these new columns over on the right. All right, then we're just going to do one more transform, which is going to be SQL. I showed you that briefly earlier. We'll do a custom transform, and here we'll drop down to PySpark SQL. I have just a single line of code for this. I'll paste this in. So here we're saying that we want to keep the columns for survived. That's our target column for training the model. In other words, the thing that we're ultimately trying to determine. And then we've got the other columns after that. So we'll preview and add. And there's obviously a lot more you can do here with additional transforms, but let's go back to the data flow. And let's talk about exporting. So one of the really powerful things about Data Wrangler is that all of the work that you just did can be exported and shared and reused. So rather than having to come in here and create a new flow and do your transforms and so on, you just export this in a variety of formats so that you can rerun the steps on a new data set or the same data set in a different environment, for example. Or maybe you just want to export this whittled down data that you just transformed. So this final piece, export, up here on the top. Let's look at some of the options. So if you come down here, click on your steps, and then you want to select the last step in the flow, and that disappeared quickly, but you'll see that it also selected all of the prior steps as well. And then up on the top right, you'll say export step. And let's start with this SageMaker pipeline here. I'll just show you what that does. This will actually create a new Jupyter notebook that creates an end-to-end workflow or pipeline to execute that data flow that we just built out. So it's pulling in your data. You'll see here from S3, we've got the Titanic CSV. We've got different output settings. We've got uploads, different processing jobs, and so on. So all the transforms and different things that we did are all baked into this notebook here. So it's repeatable, something that you can incorporate into your overall machine learning lifecycle for your project. All right, back to our flow. Let's just briefly look at some of these other options. So again, with your final step selected, you'll see that you can also save to S3. This also creates a notebook that will run on the data and then save that data to an S3 bucket. So maybe this was just a one-time thing that you needed to run to clean up the data, and then somebody else is going to grab it from S3 and do something else with it. And I'll just show you one last thing, which is that you can export as Python code. So maybe you want to paste this code into a larger code base. You can also save it to the feature store. So those are the basics of working with Data Wrangler to analyze and transform your data with this really friendly interface. But wait, if you were following along, let's make sure we shut everything down, or you could end up with a big surprise bill, which is never fun. So over here on the left, click on this Running Terminals and Kernels button if it's not already selected. And then here under Running Apps, if you click this X here, that'll shut down all of your app sessions. So I'll click on that, shut down all. I'll also close out of these notebooks that I opened. And just make sure that all of your kernels, your instances, your apps, everything here is shut down, and you should be good to go. So that's it. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, check out some of the other videos in my AWS playlist and consider subscribing to be notified when I upload new things. Thanks so much for watching.